So, why January the 26th? Well, January 26th marks the day in 1788 when Captain Arthur Phillip and his fleet hoisted the Union Jack in Sydney Cove, New South Wales, on the sovereign land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Under European law, in the late 1700s, Britain was permitted to occupy land if it was considered uninhibited. This legal fiction, terra nullius, allowed Britain to declare Australia as empty and claimed it as its own to settle. Now, for the Crown, this was momentous. However, for First Nations people, this date represents something very different: the beginning of colonisation, dispossession, cultural destruction, and ongoing intergenerational trauma. Now, today, many people refer to January 26th as Invasion Day, Survival Day, or a day of mourning. Now, for a little bit of history. In the 19th century, different colonies marked their own foundation days, and by 1888, almost all of them observed January 26th. Early celebrations, however, were more about loyalty to the British Empire rather than a national Australian identity. During World War I, Australia Day was first used as a fundraising event, and it was actually held on July 30th. It wasn't until 1935 that all the states agreed to call the celebration Australia Day. Now, from this, there was much resistance from First Nations people, with protests in 1938 demanding that Australia Day was to be declared as a day of mourning. So now we come to the key challenge at the heart of this issue. On one hand, there is a desire to have a day that unifies Australians, celebrating shared achievements and diverse identity. On the other hand, some say the current date excludes and marginalises the culture that should be central to Australia's story. Instead of fostering unity, does January 26 actually deepen division? Does it remind many Australians of the violence, land theft, and policies of assimilation that followed colonisation? The complexity here lies in balancing national pride with historical truth. Some argue that changing the date would be a step forward to reconciliation. Others believe that by keeping it on January 26th, this is a vital piece of Australia's national identity. So the real question is, should a national holiday that claims to represent all Australians be tied to a date that symbolises pain and loss for so many? Now, when we consider the debate around January 26th, it's important to acknowledge both perspectives: those who want the date changed and those who believe it should remain. For many Australians, particularly within older generations, January 26 holds deep patriotic value. It's seen as tradition, a chance to celebrate national identity, and a moment of pride in Australia's achievements. For these people, the day is strongly tied to nationalism and a sense of belonging. Another common argument is that changing the date will not alter the lives of Indigenous Australians. They argue that symbolic gestures like moving the holiday cannot replace the real need for systematic reforms, such as improved health outcomes, education opportunities, and recognition of land rights. There is also concern that if we move the date, we risk losing the opportunity for national reflection. Some argue that January 26th, with all of its complexity, forces our country to confront its history, and it's worried that by shifting the holiday, we may forget not only the achievements, but also the injustices that are tied to this day. In other words, would changing it silence the debate rather than deepen it? So yes, of course, there are many things to celebrate about Australia and being Australian: our landscapes, our multiculturalism, but January 26th is not an inclusive date for everyone. Some people say, well, I'm not celebrating genocide, I'm just enjoying time with my family and friends, having a barbecue. But the reality is, any celebration on this day is also a day of mourning for First Nations people. For them, January 26th marks the beginning of invasion, dispossession, and cultural destruction. It's isolating and cruel to ask Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to celebrate a day that symbolises their suffering. If Australia Day is supposed to unite us all, why are we singling out the one group of whom this land truly belongs? Some people argue that changing the date won't improve Indigenous lives. And it's true, changing the date alone won't end systematic disadvantage in a heartbeat. However, it might create a cultural shift. Symbols matter. Changing the date is a step forward towards truth-telling and positive change. Change is uncomfortable, but imagine the terror Indigenous people experienced when they were forced to change, stripped of their autonomy, violently displaced, and subject to colonization. That's true discomfort. We also have to remember January 26 hasn't always been fixed. In fact, Australia Day was not nationally recognised until 1935 and not celebrated uniformly on January 26th until 1994, being shifted state to state to line up with the long weekend. So when people claim the date is tradition, the truth is it's a very recent invention. So now we come to, what does January 26 actually symbolise? Colonization, dispossession, and genocide. The population of Indigenous people decreased a devastating 90% between 1788 and 1900. Many died from introduced diseases or were just simply killed. Children were stolen from their families, and communities were attempted to be destroyed. This isn't ancient history, and it's the lived reality of many families still today. Since the Royal Commission in 1991, that being the Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody, over 600 people have died in custody with no justice and no accountability. Life expectancy remains much lower for Indigenous people. Health outcomes are poorer. This is ongoing inequality. Another point to consider is that other nations show us there could be a better way forward. Although not perfect by any means, New Zealand is an example. Its National Day, Waitangi Day, commemorates the Treaty of Waitangi, regarded as the nation's founding document. It's a day centred on truth-telling, reflection, and Indigenous state relations. So where does this leave us? Some say we should change the date to create an inclusive national holiday. Others argue abolish it entirely, recognizing that celebration without justice is hollow. Others suggest renaming and reframing the day, acknowledging it openly as Invasion Day, Survival Day, or a day of mourning. Already, we see a shift happening. Major businesses like Woolworths have taken Australia Day merchandise off their shelves. Major sporting organisations no longer recognise January 26 as a day of celebration. And across the country, protests and Survival Day events are growing stronger every year. The truth is, Indigenous people declared January 26 as a day of mourning before Australia Day ever existed. So we have a choice: cling to a date that divides us, or take a step towards healing and unity. Ultimately, the complexity of this issue reflects a deeper question: whose stories are centered in our national identity and whose are silenced? Any path forward requires truth-telling, empathy, and the willingness to create a day that genuinely includes all Australians.